Welcome to Weird Web Radio, an explorer's guide to hidden worlds of the paranormal and occult, reality-expanding experiences, and the downright weird and bizarre. With your host, Lonnie Scott.
Welcome to all you weirdos out there. This is Weird Web Radio. Today we have a very special guest. Her name is Paige Zaferiou. Paige is a tarot and astrology reader. She's a medium. She also calls herself a folk magic practitioner, and she's on a mission to infuse the world with magic, and that's something that we all can get behind. Paige's readings are upbeat, they're positive, and they always offer practical advice for dealing with the weirdness of being alive. I, myself, have taken some of Paige's advice. I have had one of her readings, and I can say that she is not lying when she says they are positive and offer wonderful advice. When she's not out there slinging cards or reading the charts, you can usually find her lost in a book or brewing up a cup of tea, or maybe she's even out there updating her witchy blog at paigezaferiou.com. Paige, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Lonnie. It is such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that very nice introduction.
Well, thank you. None of this would be possible without people like you coming on the show, and I'm really excited to expose all the world to your upbeat energy and the unique insight that you'll bring to the table. Why don't we go ahead and get started at the top? When do you think you actually knew that you were going to be a witch?
Oh, what a good question. I first knew, I think it was really my 11th birthday. I was given for my 11th birthday a copy of the brand new, just published in America, first Harry Potter book by a literary aunt who was a little ahead of the curve. She gave me this American Harry Potter and then the British edition of the second book, which had not yet been published in the States. And I was a very voracious reader as a child, especially the sort of fantastical adventure books. But reading Harry Potter, it was the first time that I really felt this sense of something inside me that said, wait, this might be, there's something true here, like really true here. And shortly afterwards, I entered the 6th grade, and I met this girl. And I fell for this girl like a ton of bricks, and it turned out her mother was a witch, was a Wiccan. And I had never encountered Wicca before. I was fascinated, and I had that sense of this escalation, like, oh, I'm onto it. I felt like a detective, like, yes, here it is in the real world. I found it. And this girl taught me how to cast a group ritual and to call the quarters, and in experiencing this ritual, which we held under a blue moon in the dead of winter on this very cold, snowy January night, I knew that I was really onto something. And it was the same winter that I discovered tea. And so the name of my business is Tarot and Tea. For this reason, these are two of the most important things in my life, and they've always been linked in my world. I encountered them both around the same time, and they both led me down these sort of train tracks of parallel exploration and knowledge, and that was really, that winter, I was 11, was the first time I knew this was something that was not just, I wasn't just dreaming of and wishing for, but that was really, truly possible.
Well, that sounds great. I think a lot of people were like you, and they found Harry Potter along the way, or something about that told you that magic is real and magic is possible. Not everyone, though, has that kind of luck to run into somebody so young that can start, maybe while not possibly pointing you in the direction you end up, but putting you on a path that makes it possible for you to get a good start. How you said that your friend's mother was a Wiccan.
Mm-hmm.
How much influence do you think that she had on you, even going forward to today?
Well, because I'm not currently, I really have never been involved in Wicca seriously. So it was really just what you said. It was this door that opened to bring me into a world in which I could then find my right path. And Wicca clearly was not the right path for me. Wicca, and Wicca is really one of the reasons why I have called myself a witch, but hesitate to do so really across the board, because the word witch has now become, in many cases, synonymous with Wicca. And Wicca is a religion. It is an organized religion. It has structure. It has form. It is its own thing, very much so. And not being part of that religion, I didn't want to confuse people too much by throwing the word witch around so freely. For other reasons as well, such as the fact that witch is a very Eurocentric term, and that can be problematic for magical practitioners of color who might not want to associate themselves with that sort of a tradition. So she really did open this door in a way and begin to lead me down the path and say, hey, look, here's this bookshop, this occult bookshop where you can find all these other doorways. And that's how I began. It was that first initial door. And then once I was through, it was like a magical Willy Wonka wonderland where I could find my own path. So Wicca influenced me in the sense that those were some of the first books I read, some of the first people I met, but I very quickly realized, okay, this is not my path, but it's closer than I'd been before. So it was that first step.
Well, that makes sense. I think a lot of people, just like Harry Potter, ends up being the inspiration. Wicca is definitely the gateway drug that gets a lot of people into witchcraft and paganism. It just happens to be one of the most prevalent written on subjects. There are a lot of Wicca 101 books out there, and not much beyond that. Especially, even if you go back 15 years ago, you may not have found a lot that explore much outside that path, unless you're looking for something written by Crowley.
Yeah, exactly. Growing up in the Boston area in the 90s, all I could find were books on Wicca, because unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, it was very hard to find it, especially as a teenager and preteen, before the internet. How were you to find these things? You had to follow these threads, and it was almost infuriating, like, this is so close, but no cigar, and I cannot find this cigar, but I'll keep looking.
Yeah, I know exactly how you feel. So you mentioned that you knew that you were not going to be a Wiccan, that Wicca was not for you, but how did you know that Wicca wasn't for you? There had to be something inside you that said, this isn't for me, or that's wrong, and what direction did that pull you to?
That's a good question. I think for me, at the time, it wasn't really anything I was articulating, more of a feeling, but looking back, I can see that part of the problem was the lack of sort of involvement of the darker side, if you will. I was a little goth baby. I loved death, I loved the weird and the macabre, and that felt very absent from the world of Wicca that I was exposed to, which isn't to say that all Wiccans are fluffy bunnies and, refuse to acknowledge the sort of darker side of things, but that was something that was very much authentic to who I was, and I did not feel it from these books. These Silver Ravenwolf books, for example, seem to be very much like, well, we don't do that. That's sort of a dirty thing. We don't curse people, or we don't talk about the dark side. That's just sort of icky. And I didn't like that. That did not feel genuine to me.
Well, again, that's an excellent answer to the question. So when you say that it lacked that darker side, what is it about that darker side that appeals to you?
I think it's the healing. We cannot heal unless we're willing to actually go to the wound and look into it. And wounds are gross. They can be full of pus and fluid, and they're just disgusting. But if you're not willing to go there, how are you gonna heal it? Our wounds are full of pain. They're full of darkness. In order to face that and integrate it and become a whole, healed, holy person, we can't do that unless we acknowledge our own shadow, go there, are willing to engage, and integrate. I think it's absolutely essential.
Agreed. None of us are just one whole light being. In fact, one of my current path of study right now is trying to get a deeper understanding of traditional Germanic soul lore, which is pretty consistent in Indo-European lore, especially amongst the Germanic people, where we didn't just have this idea of one soul. We actually had parts to our being, and each had its own function and role.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I look into that lore and the more I start to understand it over the last couple of years, it seems to me that we've lost something as a people all over the world. It doesn't matter what color or creed you are, but we've been sold an idea of either or black or white, and it just seems like there's so much more rich depth to all that we are and we can be. And I think the more people explore some of this more traditional wisdom, the more they're going to find that.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Very well said.
Thank you. Now, who would you say were some of your major influences?
Ooh. Well, some of my earliest influences were more in the fictional world. One of my biggest influences was the young adult author, Tamara Pierce. She wrote books like Song of the Lioness Quartet and Circle of Magic and the Immortals series. These were books that usually featured a female protagonist who had some sort of magical ability and was navigating this sort of medievalish fantasy world. But I don't know what this woman's deal is, but she clearly knows what she's talking about, because these books contain little nuggets of magical techniques that I have been using since I was, 12, 13, 14 years old. Very simple, but very effective. Let's see, such as these sort of centering techniques, protective techniques, the idea of being in harmony with nature or being in right relationship with animals, our personal power and where that can take us. The idea of having each of us has our own sort of unique gifts, and that these gifts have their own sort of color or aura, all these different ideas that became seeded in my little baby brain and have come with me all these years. And rereading these books recently, I was floored. Like, oh man, there's good stuff in here. There's really good stuff in here. Yeah. So a lot of fiction. Obviously, Lord of the Rings and Tolkien were huge influences on me. I learned Elvish in high school, and just it allows you to really geek out and dig deep into these mythos, mythology and fairy tales. Obviously, these are the most ancient. Oh, delicious! Like, I'm almost speechless when I think about it. It makes me want to eat a book. I'm so happy. There's so much wisdom in these stories. And so much truth if we know how to read them properly. I just completed the first session of Brianna Saucy's Spinning Gold course, a year-long course in magic and fairy tales. And it affirmed everything that I've known my whole life, that these stories have so much to teach us. There's a very non-literal way to read them that has value. And it's simply even as a way to connect with our ancestral line and with the old world. There's great value. I also, along that vein, have always been digging and finding more stories, more different ways of these stories being told. And one of my favorites was Sarah Ann Lawless's podcast that she did, where she explores certain fairy tales and folk tales and again talks about how to engage with them, how to read them. What is actually going on here? This sounds, because these stories on the surface sound ridiculous, man turns into swan for 7 years. Like, what are you talking about? That's crazy. But there's so much under the surface there. And Sarah's blog as well, and her herbal products have been a huge influence on me for years. I've been in, I'm almost speechless when I think about herbs in the plant world. I have this book of medicinal herbs that I've had since I can remember. And it recently occurred to me to ask my mother, who gave me this complete medicinal herbal book? And she looks at me like, you asked for it, kid. You wanted that. So the natural world has also been one of my biggest influences, just learning about plants and animals, and in a way that I don't know if I could really describe. It's one of those things you just feel the soul need to follow this. You're like, I don't know why I need to dig in the ground, but I do.
It's interesting that you described the myths and the fairy tales as having so much impact on you, and you said something I think is really important. You mentioned it's how you approach these stories and how you read them. But when you say that, when you're reading them, how are you reading them then? What is it that you're looking for when you approach a myth or a fairy tale?
Well, I usually will read it through several times because as an Aries, the first time through, I'm always swept up in just the story itself and the excitement and sort of surface level thrill of the story. And then I go back through, and what I'm often doing is I'm looking for, I'm trying to think how to describe this. Maybe I'll describe the technique that I often use, which I learned, again, from my teacher, Brianna Saucy. And it's how she taught me to approach dreams, but it works just as well for folk and fairy tales, where you go through and you take the nouns and some of the verbs, and you think, what does this mean to me? What is the other side of this? How does it go down deep? It makes me think of the alethiometer in the His Dark Materials books, The Golden Compass, The Subtle Knife, etc., where she talks about reading this truth-telling device and how for her the reading experience is like going down this ladder of symbolism and finding what is feeling into which of these symbols is being expressed here and now in this story. And it feels like that. It feels like a delicious layer cake. It feels like there's so many ways to read it. And then it almost becomes a Mad Lib sort of thing where you plug in, okay, this is what I think this means. And then I can go back and do research. Okay, well, at the time and place where this story comes from, this is what this means to those people. This is what the swan means to these people. This is what the water means for these people. These are their cosmology. So there's the layers of surface level of story, my own personal meaning of each sort of symbolism and an archetype, and then the actual research of, okay, where does this come from? Who are these people? What does this mean to them? What is the context of this story? Who is telling it, and why might they have been doing so? And then you can sort of synthesize all of these in a delicious soup of the mind and find some sort of medicine for yourself here and now. Because these stories can be useful for us our whole lives, and they can have different meanings in medicine at different times, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. Something that I see a lot of people struggle with around the world of paganism is that idea that myth is not a news report. And it's not a history book necessarily either. It's something that's alive and it's always interacting. That mythic time sort of just keeps happening. It's always now, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
You also mentioned in passing working with your ancestors. Now, I remember back in the my own early days of getting into the occult and paganism, and just like you find a lot of Wicca books, or you can find a lot of Crowley books, or the book that could be a weapon, the Golden Dawn. And, you know, I recall none of these books talked about working with our ancestors. None of them mentioned how important ancestral work is or can be to your life. And it's a very vital part of my path today. And I've noticed it coming more and more into the awareness of every pagan path that I come across. How did you come about the idea of honoring your ancestors as part of your spiritual work?
Good question. For me, I think it was a very organic process, and I'm very, very fortunate in that I come from a family where there were many interesting stories, and I've always been interested in those stories in this sort of wordless, like, yes, these are my people. I want and need to know these things. Also, it's interesting. My father's father, Socrates, is Greek from the Greek islands and has so many interesting stories I can't even begin. It makes me want to lie down. I'm just so happy and grateful to have these stories and this ancestral connection. And in a practical sense, it gives you a great place to start. If you are looking to begin or to deepen your practice, Where do you begin? Well, you begin where you are. Looking backwards, you begin with where you came from. If you want to begin diving deeper into mythology, why not begin with the myths and legends of your own ancestral line? And after getting older and expanding beyond just I love Papu's stories of, the old olive farm, etc., and begin to dive deeper into this, perhaps it began to deepen when I started to become aware of my mediumship abilities, and dead relatives started to show up in little ways, sometimes in the mirror, which was quite frightening. And that became sort of these clues. I can look back on my life and see these little, with hindsight, of course, can see these moments and these sort of hints of, we are here. We have your back. You can always turn to us because we genuinely care about whether or not you succeed. Like, I find out people often turn to the big deities right away. Like, yeah, I want to work with badass Zeus or whatever. Like, Zeus doesn't really necessarily care if you get that job or this or that happens that you want to happen. But your ancestors care. They really care. They are invested in you because you are their legacy. And you are the continuum. And just like you said earlier, that this myth time is sort of always happening, so too, dealing with our ancestors really grounds us in the continuum of time that is always happening, and the time beyond time and the space beyond space. It's very comforting to realize we are not alone, and we stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before us. And I want to specify also that when I'm talking about ancestors, of course I am talking about my biological lineage, but we can also talk about our ancestors of spirit, those who we feel a kinship to, but who are not related to. People like, for me, like Frida Kahlo. I'm a visual artist, I'm a painter, and Frida Kahlo has been this ancestor of spirit of mine my whole life. I've always, like, looking at her paintings as a little child that were hanging on the walls of our house, I don't even have words to describe how that made me feel and how it made me want to make art, and how it makes me think of a line from this Joni Mitchell song where she sings, "Love is touching souls. Surely you've touched mine because part of you comes out of me," in these lines from time to time.
That's excellent. Beautiful. I like that you point out, too, that the ancestors that we work with aren't just those of blood and bone, as I like to say in my own rights. Mm-hmm. Something else I say in my own rights when I honor my ancestors is that I'm also working with those of spirit and hearth, that, those who have broken the barriers that we can even practice our arts today without fear of persecution should be a part of those that you honor every day.
Absolutely.
Yeah, without them, we wouldn't even be here today. Mm-hmm. At least not able, we wouldn't be able to do this without fear. What would you say to those who, this is a popular question I see come up whenever the idea of ancestral work comes up in the spiritual realm. When someone says, my ancestors were Christian for the last 1,000 years, so what interest would they have in me practicing magic or the occult?
That's a really good question. To that end, I would say something that I learned from my good friend Kai Armand, who is a very talented root doctor and shamanic practitioner. And he reminds me often that when we're calling in our ancestors, we are calling in our elevated ancestors, our resolved ancestors, those who have sort of gone to the other side successfully, reunited with Source, and are now accessible as elevated spiritual guides. We're not necessarily wanting to deal with those who were not so nice people and who have not resolved themselves yet on the other side. We don't want the witch hunters and the rapists and the thieves of our line to be involved in our work necessarily, unless they have gone through and healed and integrated. Because if our ancestors were Christian and they have been successfully integrated and elevated, then they will understand that it's all, that spirit is spirit, that all is all, and that it is whichever path we are accessing this through here and now is valid and legitimate, just as their spirituality is valid and legitimate. Does that make sense?
Excellent point. Yes, that makes perfect sense. So let's imagine out there right now there's someone listening who's a brand new witch or folk magic practitioner, and she or he has been listening at the edge of her seat, and thank you for listening, by the way. They're curious about this ancestral work. What would you tell them that they could take away and start right now?
Good question. I would say one of the best places to begin is to create an altar. There are many resources you can find on this. I strongly recommend Sarah Ann Lawless's blog. She has several posts, I believe, on beginning to work with your ancestors and creating an ancestor altar. I also recommend Brianna Saucy. She has a class on working with the ancestors, and she may have several blog posts as well. But to create an altar space is to really physically set the intention that I want to deepen this relationship. I am here for it. I am physically, literally creating space for this relationship in my life. And altars, that's a very broad term, I know. It can be anything from a small shelf to the inside of a drawer, if you don't want to draw attention to this, to a wall-mounted situation. It's infinitely variable, practically. So do some research into ancestor altars and just make that space. And then you can go from there. And it's really a lifelong relationship. You don't have to worry about getting it perfect right here and now. Just begin. Just begin. It's going to be imperfect. It's going to be a struggle. It's going to be confusing. But begin where you can and go from there. Begin to and then as well, begin to learn about your ancestors. And not all of us have a connection to our biological ancestors. So if you can't go down that road, or if you don't want to because of whatever reason, which there are many that we might not want to go down that road, you can begin with your ancestors of spirit, the people who have passed beyond this world, who have always been a major inspiration to you. Ever since David Bowie passed, I have talked to so many people who are practically in tears over the fact that this man has had such an influence on my life. I wouldn't be where I am without him. If there's someone in your life who you've never met and have no biological relationship to, but who has passed beyond this world and makes you feel that way, start there as well. Those are absolutely valid ancestors to talk to. And we also can think about the ancestors so far back in history that we do not know their names, we do not know their faces, we can have no actual information about them like we can with our great-grandparents, for example. But they're important too, our deep, deep, deep ancestors. So we can start by making that physical space, by thinking outside the box. We're not just talking to grandpa and grandma. There's so much more out there than just those recent past biological ancestors.
Excellent advice. An altar is a wonderful way to get started. I myself got started working with my ancestors years ago by doing nothing more than setting up a few pictures of ancestors that I knew and approaching them as ancestors both by name, the friends that I've lost from this life, and then, as I said before, those of spirit and heart, those people who made my path possible, and the deep ancestors as well. Talk to them. Go to your altar every day and tell them what's going on in your life. Build a relationship like you would. It's just like visiting grandma. Mm-hmm. And offer a simple, clean glass of water, if nothing else. People sort of shake their head when I suggest clean water is a wonderful offering, but that's a rare gift that we take for granted in our own world.
Amen. It really, really is.
It is, and it's something that our own ancestors have very rarely enjoyed. So,
yeah, I would also add to that, if you don't feel quite comfortable yet actually talking out loud to your ancestors, write them a letter, just like you would write grandma a letter.
Yes.
Not everyone wants to talk out loud. Some people feel weird, or it just doesn't feel right for whatever reason. Absolutely feel free to write a letter and either put the letter on the altar, or some traditions recommend you burn a letter to the dead so that they can I envision it sort of dispersing into the universe and somehow winding up in their inbox of the dead.
Yeah. Yes. I have a small basket that I like to place letters into, and that makes it feel like it's been delivered.
Yes, I love that. Yes, delivering this letter.
Yes. Now, let's rewind a little bit, since we've covered ancestors. You mentioned that part of what brought you to your ancestors was being a medium and beginning to see dead relatives, even in the mirror, which you really stressed is a distressing moment in your past. Mm-hmm. So describe how you knew you were becoming a medium. How did those skills develop?
It's been a very strange road, and it wasn't until actually many years later that I really, really realized, oh, those were real experiences. I wasn't making those up. That was completely valid because I did not have really a support network as a child of people who understood that tradition or those abilities and who were able to give me context. I remember telling an adult, like, I saw this deceased relative in the mirror, and I was told, don't ever say that again. Don't you ever, ever say that. And so I actually no longer see with my eyes the way I did as a child the dead. I either turned it off because it was too scary or because I was told, don't ever say that again, do not do that thing. So it wasn't until I was really grown and already happily walking down the magical path that it came back around, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is really happening. And let me think, when did I really realize that this was something valid? It was actually relatively recently. It was only a few years ago, and it was when I began working with Holy Death, with Santa Muerte as an entity, as she very much appeared strongly in my life and said, we're doing stuff. It's happening. Let's get it on. I was like, okay. All right, let's do it. And looking back, it was, again, looking back with hindsight once I had the context and I could say, oh, of course. Now it all makes sense. I'd always been obsessed with death. I'd always felt very comfortable in cemeteries, and it all made sense after that work began, and I began to cultivate a relationship with her. And again, to build an altar and to engage in that dialogue. And it was very imperfect, as it is, as a practice always is. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. You had already mentioned that you were attracted to the more darker elements within the occult and the pagan world. And death it doesn't get much more of a darker force than that. It's especially here in the West, where we tend to try to hide it from ourselves, and we try to ignore the fact that it's going to happen. I've had the unfortunate experience of burying a great many friends and one parent, and I'm telling you that if the more comfortable you are with the idea that you have to die, and getting comfortable with that, it will have a huge impact on your life and how you treat other people, knowing that they themselves are facing that road. But you've gone one step further. Now, do you communicate with spirits of the dead simply by hearing them, since you mentioned you don't see them?
Yes, I can hear them sort of, with the inner ear, and I can feel them. These abilities really coalesced, and this is something, again, that can be very, depending on your upbringing and the environment in which you live, can be very difficult to really accept in yourself and in your life. And it wasn't until my grandfather passed away and I was present and had the very visceral experience of, okay, there is the body, and over here is the spirit, and I am hyper aware of both of them. And that really was like, okay, you're super duper not making this up. This is really happening. Go with it. That was really the moment when I was like, okay, all right, I accept this. I'm working with it. Let's do this.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, where does tarot come into play in all of this?
Tarot is my favorite tool, and it is a tool, obviously, and it's it's a constant in my life and my practice. As I mentioned, I'm a visual artist. I'm a watercolor painter, and I'm particularly interested in comics, graphic novels, and sequential art, what we might call the umbrella term for all those things. And so when I found tarot, it was like, oh, yes, the heavens opened. It was like a movie. You know, we ran to each other across a field in slow motion. I brought this deck home, and it's this language that I can speak so well. So tarot helps me when I'm seeking guidance, when I need clarity, and it can also be helpful in a non-divination capacity, like say I'm working some magic, or say I'm doing a spell, or say I'm building an altar for a specific purpose. I might pull out some tarot cards that represent either the entities or the energy or the goal or intentions that I have with building this altar, and put them up there as visual focus areas for me. So tarot, I think, is very versatile, but for me mostly it is like a daily exercising my intuition muscle. Just like, you know, you might have weights at home. I have my tarot deck. And your weights exercise your physical muscles, and the tarot exercises my intuitive muscles.
Well, you and I are definitely kindred spirits on that. So when you say you have it's part of your daily work, what is your daily practice? What does that look like?
It can be different every day. I'm pretty mutable, so I try not to rein it in too much, but at the very bare minimum, every day I engage in some kind of stillness and silence practice, where some people say that they meditate every day, and I do try to do that as well. And those things can overlap, but for me, the most important thing, being a very high energy person, is stillness and silence. I don't think we spend enough time doing that these days. It's so easy, like when you're waiting in line at the post office, rather than daydream or just sort of be in your body, cultivate that calmness, that inner calmness, that stillness. We just go on our phones. And that takes away that opportunity to go into our inner landscape and sort of just be there, either listening to what's going on inside or actively calming it down. So I try to do both of those things. I try to actively listen to what's the ticker tape in my mind going on about, what are the feelings swirling around inside, how can I, and then I listen to them, then I calm them down, then I listen again to say, okay, now that we're all chill, what's going on? What are we talking about? What do I need to know? Any messages? And so in terms of messages, that's when I pull my daily cards. I pull cards every day for myself, and then as well for my greater community that I post to social media as sort of a general message of here's the energy of today, here's some advice for how best to use that energy. And then for myself, I'll often pull cards for specific bits of advice or just generally, what do I need to know today as I go out and try to be an adult. And then I'll do specific divinations like, okay, I'm about to do this magical working. Let's see what's really going on. What best magical technique would address this condition? So depending on the day, I might do all of these things. I might just do a little bit of cultivating calmness if that's all I have the time and bandwidth for today. And then, of course, I will tend my altars, which doesn't happen, again, every single day, depending on how much time I have and how much energetic bandwidth I have, or how many spoons I have, if you will, as the mental health community says. I will put fresh water on the altar. I will light a candle, some incense. I'll commune out loud. I'll listen, because that's the important part of communion. You talk, but you also listen. It goes both ways. You don't just go to grandma's house and talk at her and then say, bye, thanks for the ice cream, without ever listening to anything she has to say. Yeah. It has to be a conversation, which does involve listening. I feel like some people forget that part of the equation, and then they wonder why the practice doesn't feel fulfilling and why they're not getting anything out of it. Well,
that's right. Yeah, the only time you go to your neighbor for the chainsaw is when you need the chainsaw.
Yeah.
Your neighbor's not going to think very fondly of you.
Exactly. And then often part of my daily practice, depending on the weather, is going outside and just taking a walk. I'm extremely fortunate. I live about half a block from an enormous, very old cemetery. And so I get to double up on that daily practice, both my being in nature walk and my walking with the dead walk, which I'm very, very lucky to get to.
You are very lucky. Since you both have, I say both, there's more than that, you describe yourself as a medium, and you enjoy the darker side of the arts. You even like to walk through the cemetery. You enjoy being in those areas, and I understand. I'm the same way. There's something calming about walking through a cemetery, and something reminding about what's not only what awaits us all, but how precious every moment you get to breathe is when you walk among all those stones. Have you ever experienced a haunting or dealt with a haunting?
Yes, I have. Let's see. The scariest one I think I ever encountered, and the most active. I remember encountering as a child a haunting in my mother's godparents' house. They lived in this amazing old house down in Connecticut on the river that had been part of the Underground Railroad and had all these old secret passages and weird hidden doorways. And there was one haunted bedroom, and I remember very distinctly rounding the corner, and then there was sort of a blank space of, ah! and a sort of vague impression of a chamber pot and some other weird things. But as an adult, as an actual active practitioner, I lived in San Francisco, downtown in the Tenderloin, in a converted residential hotel where in the 80s a serial killer had made one of his first kills.
Oh, boy.
And it was in the basement of the building where we all had to do our laundry. So for the year I was there, I'd go down, take the elevator down, and it could feel a palpable chill as the elevator descended to the first floor basement. And it would sort of sing a little song to myself because the spirit was a child. It was so unbelievably tragic, and the energy was very unresolved. So at the end of my year there, after kind of coexisting with this spirit, fortunately for me, I lived on the top floor, as far away from the basement as you could be. So that was a blessing. I was able to sleep at night. So after we began to move out, we cleared all the furniture out of our apartment, all the stuff, and after everything that belonged to me was gone, I sat down in the closet, so it was dark, and helped resolve this spirit, and that was the beginning of part of the beginning of my calling as, I guess, a sort of psychopompic practitioner, one who helps unresolved spirits transition to the other side. And it was very intense. It was a little bit frightening, but it was less frightening than simply coexisting because it felt like, okay, I'm doing something. I don't really necessarily know what I'm doing. I'm being spirit-led. I didn't have a human teacher for this. It was working with the spirit, my helping spirits who helped me with this kind of work, leading me through what I'm supposed to do, which is both very exciting and very unnerving and a little bit frightening, but very satisfying at the end of the day when it actually works. Imagine, can you imagine? Oh, fantastic.
I can imagine. Yes, it's something wonderful that overwhelms you when it does in fact work. Now, you said that you are a psychopomp practitioner, and even described it as a calling. So what is that? What are you doing to answer that call?
Well, I have, in addition to my daily practices, I have sort of monthly practices. And one of those is an arrangement that I have with some of my helping spirits where I sort of journey, because I'm also a shamanic practitioner. I sort of go on a journey to this predetermined location and where my helping spirits have gathered some of the sort of local unresolved dead, and I help them to transition. So I do this regularly every month on the same moon phase. I help these local folks who are struggling to transition. Actually, to be fair, I don't know if they're all local. Whoever my helping spirits have gathered, I help them transition. And then sort of as needed in my professional practice, if clients come to me with this sort of work, I can help them, either someone in their lives or they've got a haunting in their building or whatever it might be. And then every once in a while, there will be, in my personal practice, my helping spirits will say, hey, someone needs your help. We will, let's go on a journey. Let's make this happen. And I will do that as led. So it is this sort of personal and professional thing that I'm doing, but I'm not currently advertising it because I'm still figuring out how to talk about that without getting carted away.
Well, I'm not sure how to say this softly, but you're already promoting yourself as a tarot reader and a folk magic practitioner. We're all mentally ill in this tribe, as far as the normal people out there are concerned.
True.
Fly your weird flag high.
Amen. Good reminder. Important. Yes.
You're welcome. That's what I do. I'll send you a bill. Okay. But that whole idea leads into something else that I wanted to talk to you about. What do you find most controversial right now going on within your own path or the various practices that you have, or even paganism and the occult at large?
Oh, boy. This might be a can of worms to open. I'll try to rein in my intense emotion about this and be succinct. There is a sort of divide in the general world of pagan occultism, etc., where some folks are of the mind that we don't really necessarily need to get involved or pay attention to some of the real-world issues involving social justice, police brutality, and the patriarchy and heteronormative culture and some of these toxic sort of mainstream issues that we absolutely can be involved in a way that honors our practice, that uses our gifts. Some people are of the mind that, yes, we absolutely should be involved, however we can. There's no, of course, one-size-fits-all way to get involved, but we can't ignore this. Some people say, oh, it's not our business. It has nothing to do with spirituality or the occult. Let people take care of themselves. And I feel in case you can't tell, I feel very strongly that we should absolutely be concerned about these things. We absolutely should be involved in these things. Again, however we are called to do so, however best our gifts can serve. If you are a gifted spellcrafter, if you are gifted at whatever particular kind of work, maybe it's protection work, maybe you can do some protection work for peaceful protesters. If you are gifted at cursing, maybe you can curse the heck out of some of the prosecutors or whatever. Maybe if you're gifted at court work, you can work on some of these court cases. For example, I remember the Brock Turner trial. There was a group of occultists, pagans, etc., who got together and did a group ritual to sort of take this guy down, I guess. And that's a very small example, but we can get involved, and we should. These are concerns for all of us. And especially if you are a white practitioner involved in any sort of tradition that calls on African traditions, East Asian traditions, and I know it's kind of a big soup pot sometimes, so almost certainly your practice involves some kind of tradition, not your own. We can be giving back. We can and we should be involved. However, and I'm not saying everyone needs to take to the streets. Not all of us are able-bodied enough to do that. Not all of us have the bandwidth to do that. But whatever resources at your disposal, I think that can be a very effective part of your practice.
Very good point. There are a lot of social justice issues in our world today, and I agree. If you're only a magic practitioner in the circle and not in the world at large, I'm not sure that your work has much effect at all. Mm-hmm. What's something that you've done yourself to assist these issues?
Well, let's see. I have some ongoing work that I can't really talk about because it's ongoing, but
Sure.
one of the mundane things we can do if you have spare cash is to donate money. Most recently, I'm very excited that one of the Kickstarter campaigns I was involved with was successful. This project to open the first fully indigenous restaurant in the United States. It's called Sioux Chef, S-I-O-U-X Chef, in Minneapolis. And the mission of this restaurant, which started out as a food truck, is not only to serve delicious indigenous food, but to teach people how to get back into the right relationship with their diets, with their foods, to connect with their ancestors, because in indigenous First Nation communities, poor nutrition is a massive issue. Poor nutrition as well as alcoholism and so many other problems that this is one small project that is taking a step in the right direction. So if you have $5, $10, $20, $50, $100 extra dollars, you can donate that and pairing it with a prayer or lighting a candle or saying an intention or creating an altar space perhaps for working with indigenous issues, modern contemporary indigenous issues. If you have any indigenous helping spirits, obviously bringing them on board. Not saying you need to go out and seek them on purpose just to be a superhero saving, white savior complex. We don't necessarily need to take it from that approach, but doing these mundane things and then pairing them with simple spiritual practices can be enormously helpful. And then creating ongoing works like, say, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got on this topic was from Professor Charles Porterfield, an extremely gifted root worker from Texas, who said, if you are interested in doing social justice magic work, take the existing sort of rituals and spells and adapt them for these social justice practices. Again, taking these protective rituals and adapting it for the protesters, taking some of these healing rituals or blessing rituals and applying them to the families who have lost people to police brutality, taking your gifts for whatever area you have a gift in and thinking, how can I apply this to the situation at hand? Getting creative and adaptive and applying what we already have. You don't have to reinvent the wheel with this work. We have everything we need at our fingertips already, but we just have to think creatively about how you can apply that to the situations that you truly care about, that are truly relevant to our time, our place, our global community, our local community. There's so many places to get started. It's almost paralyzing, I know, but start somewhere. That's better than not starting at all.
I agree. That's very good advice. I also think that feeds back into your idea of cultivating stillness and taking time out to do that as a practice. Mm-hmm. We are exposed to a lot in the world today, and it can feel very overwhelming, and the benefit of cultivating that stillness as a practice can help alleviate the symptoms of the overwhelming stress of the world today. So, getting back to your own path and your own work, what would you describe as some of your key principles?
Oh, wow, good question. My key principles. If I were a character with like a catchphrase, my catchphrase would be, it's all good. It's all good. It really is. It's all so good. I'll tell you a story that might sum up some of my principles. I used to work as a nanny, and the best question I ever got asked was from a little boy about 4 years old. And he looked up at me from his snack and he said, Paige, when does God die?
Oh.
Yes, I have been waiting my whole life for this question. I didn't know it. So I explained the cyclical nature of the universe to him, using Alan Watts's metaphor of hide and seek. I said, well, everything in the universe used to just be God. It was all God, and then God got kind of lonely, It's just being God. So God decided that it would play hide and seek with itself and pretend to be all the separate planets and galaxies and people and animals and plants. And that's where we are now. We are all the separate, apparently separate things that are all really just God playing hide and seek with itself. And eventually God will win the game of hide and seek, and everything will go back to just being God. And then the cycle will start over, and God will get lonely again and play hide and seek again, and that will continue as a cycle until maybe something else happens. I don't know. And he was like, great, cool, got it, let's play Legos now.
Yeah, so it's a cycle now, give me the Lego.
Yep, cool, nailed it, thanks, got it.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so I really do believe that. I believe everything is connected. We are all divine. Everything from the lowliest ant and spider to the biggest bald eagle, blue whale, what have you, to the weirdest people, to the most normal people. We all have divinity within us. We're all just bags of flesh pretending to be separate when we're all really one delicious thing. Unspeakable, delicious spirit thing. I don't know. I don't pretend to have all the answers.
Well said. Somewhere out there's going to be a T-shirt now that says "Unspeakable Delicious Spirit Thing." They can't fit it on the back of sweatpants yet.
We're working on it.
Right. Okay. Paige, we're winding down now, and I wanted to thank you for being on the show. I don't want to keep you from doing whatever you've got going on today, but it's a great honor to have been able to speak with you about your path and the various things that you hold to be very important in life. I could not express my gratitude enough for you being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Lonnie. I have enjoyed this conversation so much. I'm thrilled about your show, and I can't wait for all the future episodes to meet all these interesting folks that I know you will gather in the weirdo world. Delicious.
Well, as I said, you are interview number 1. But before you go, I want to know a couple things.
Mm-hmm.
If you could give someone new to this path, or even an experienced practitioner, a book, just one book that's had a great impact on you and you believe is important enough to give it as a gift, what would it be?
No hesitation, it would be Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes.
Women Who Run with the Wolves.
Mm-hmm.
What makes that one important?
It's, I don't want, good question. Let's see, the subtitle of the book is Myths and Stories of the Wild Woman Archetype, but I do think it's useful for everyone, women or no. It talks about how do I even describe the goodness that is this book? It helps you to really dig deep into your own psyche, to really understand the journey that we make on the inside, and it ties back in with what we were saying earlier, learning how to read myths and legends. She gives many examples of myths and legends, and then dives into their significance and really teaches you how to read into these stories. She expresses the importance of storytelling, the value of what's in here, and I look back on this book almost every time that I'm going through something. There is some chapter that's relevant. She talks about the beginning initiation, about dealing with our bodies, about the traps of the world, about how to find your pack and belong, about how to find your mate and the idea of the lover, and all these, just the whole, it feels like a very holistic, your entire life story can be synthesized and understood and guided by this book. I can't sing its praises enough. It's just delicious. Here, right on the back, it says, "This volume reminds us that we are nature for all our sophistication, that we are still wild, and the recovery of that vitality will itself set us right in the world."
That sounds like an interesting read.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the recommendation. And finally, if you could be a tarot card for the day, what one would you be?
For the day or for all time?
Let's not be stingy, just today.
Just today, okay. That would be one for today. I would be the Chariot. It's the dark of the moon. I'm feeling low energy. I need to rally.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, Paige, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Lonnie.
You're very welcome, and I hope that all of you out there have gotten great benefit from listening to Paige and I talk about what it's like to be a folk magic practitioner, how to confront things when they pop up in your mirror and you see dead relatives, and even inspired you to get involved with social justice issues. Don't be afraid and don't be ashamed of who you are. Everyone out there, I want you to grab your flag that says that you're weird. That makes you wonderful and helps fill this world with magic. You do what you do, and stay awesome out there, folks. Thank you. Okay, Paige, if you want to tell everybody out there real quick, where can they find you?
You can find me at my website, paigezaferiou.com. That's PAIGEZAFERIOU.com. And if you have trouble spelling my last name, just know that it has all the vowels in order, A-E-I-O-U. And you can find me on social media at Tarot and Tea, especially Instagram, where I post my daily tarot readings, and also on Twitter.
Okay, gang, that's a wrap on this episode of Weird Web Radio. Once again, thank you all for listening. Now, it's time for you to go join the official Weird Web Radio membership. Go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio and you can choose your rewards and become a member today. Enjoy all the exclusive benefits, inside information, and plenty of bonus audio with each guest. Now, you can find the show at weirdwebradio.com and weirdwebradio.libsyn.com. The show is listed on Facebook and Twitter as Weird Web Radio, and you can find me on Instagram as just Lonnie_Scott. Please remember to rate and comment and share the shows that you like, and it helps others find us in all the search results. Shoot me an email if you want to be a guest on the show, or if you know someone that would be a great guest in upcoming episodes. You can send that to weirdwebradio@gmail.com. Seek the mysteries and delights in life, my friends. As always, stay weird out there.